and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. Stephen Loynd is the founder and principal analyst at TrendzOwl. He's based in Washington, D.C., and for many years he headed the digital transformation practice at Frost and Sullivan. It's fair to say that he's one of the most respected and sought-after analysts for executives that are trying to figure out how their company will operate in the future. Stephen has published research on digital transformation, but what's really interesting about his work is that he tends to think far beyond what we see with most corporate commentators. You're just as likely to hear him quoting James Joyce or Antonio Gramsci when explaining the digital transformation of society, rather than the usual academic text. I asked Stephen to introduce TrendzOwl and then to talk about some of the digital changes we're seeing today and how this affects executives that are planning for a better customer experience. Okay, let's go straight to the interview. Right, Steve, so thanks for speaking on the podcast again. First, you're no longer with Frost and Sullivan. You've launched a new venture, TrendzOwl. So what are you focused on now with TrendzOwl?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me. Really excited for my new venture, and what I'm trying to do with TrendzOwl is to continue this real deep interest of mine in trying to wrestle with how rapidly the world is changing, specifically due to exponential technological change. And so you and I have talked a lot at different analyst events and over the past few years about the effects of what they called at Davos a few years ago, the fourth industrial revolution, meaning how technology and data is embedding itself into just about everything as far as every aspect of our lives. And technology has become so pervasive, as we know. It's moving so fast. It's disrupting really how we live our lives every day in small and subtle ways that are building over time, it seems to me. And it's also disrupting business and how we consume and how we exist as organizations. And so to try to keep up with that, I wanted to kind of pursue that passion and think and dive more deeply into it and sort of see where it takes me. And that's really the start of TrendzOwl after a number of years at a couple of really good analyst firms, getting some great global experience.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah, and I know you've written a lot about the digital society and the way that, beyond just how companies are functioning, but how people are communicating and behaving because of these technologies. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we forget that it's only been the last decade where we've had all these changes, such as social media, smartphones. You know, the iPhone only came out 12 years ago, and before that, the online phone experience was pretty awful. Do you think that leaders, executives are sort of considering this bigger picture of how people's behavior is changing when they're actually planning their corporate strategy?
Well, that's a big question. So, for example, I think it was in 2016 in the retail industry, there were a number of a rash of bankruptcies, if you will, with companies such as Sports Authority, Aeropostale, and BHS that all went out of business. Yeah, I think it was in the March to May timeframe. And there were a lot of analysts that were pointing to the fact that those companies, one could argue, were failing to digitally transform quickly enough, which resulted in losing ground to competitors who were adapting and much more nimble and much more agile when it came to and comes to digital transformation. Now, obviously, a lot of these retail bankruptcies, there's a lot of complexities involved, and one might point to the role of perhaps private equity in some of these as well. But nonetheless, it's an example of how, you know, the serious repercussions of not keeping up with and not staying on top with how quickly things are changing. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, had a great quote a few years ago that the true scarce commodity going forward is going to be human attention. And rather than things like oil or people keep talking about data as a real a scarce and important resource, or not scarce, but important resource going forward. But it's really about human attention and being able to attract and retain and customers and to really develop core customers and keep their attention, keep their interest, and grow their passion in whatever your brand is or whatever activity it is that an organization is engaged in.
Yeah. And we're seeing this sort of approach, like a data-driven approach, AI-first approach, alongside a lot of new individual technologies. And I think that some of them could even be game-changing. I mean, could create new industries. IoT, the Internet of Things, for example. I mean, who would have thought that Wi-Fi-enabled light bulbs were going to be a thing in future? But I mean that, as we look at this broad sweep of emerging technologies and changing attitudes towards customer attention, what kind of market impact do you think that some of these changes will have in the area of customer experience then?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that because of how quickly things are changing and because organizations have to be nimble and adapt and in effect become agile and digitally transformed enterprises. I like that term. And I think what that means at the end of the day, in real terms, is there's a real need for elegance and simplicity in the pursuit of frictionless experiences, if you will. Think about it at so many in the workplace as well. I mean, I'm becoming more and more interested in not just the search for the frictionless experience for the customer, but also for employees. And the customer experience and the employee experience are very much intertwined, as is the user experience. And so it's kind of the Amazon example. And as things become ever more complex, on the one hand with technology, paradoxically, we're all, it seems to me, going to be in pursuit of relatively effortless experience as customers and employees. And so I'm a big believer, for example, in companies that measure customer effort. I think that's really important because people's their expectations today in the workplace as well as customers and consumers, we just don't have patience for overly complex, sclerotic systems or things that are going to interfere with our ability to, whether it's purchase something or get something done at work. It's all intertwined. And I think that's what we're seeing now, that these two forces, things are becoming ever more complex technologically, you can argue, and there's an ever-expanding universe of data. And at the same time, we're trying to get our hands, get a grip on that ever-expanding universe and make it more simple for ourselves. And those are two things that are somewhat in conflict. And so I think that's a big challenge for both organizations and for individuals. And it's, back to this idea of the fourth industrial revolution where technology is racing ahead so quickly. And we as individuals, some of us and organizations are lagging behind a bit. And that's producing, one might argue, this sense of vertigo where we're trying to figure out at this point in time, as you said a few minutes ago, I mean, the last decade, we've seen the advance of so many technology platforms and social media, the last 10 or 15 years, the growth of things like Facebook that weren't around just a few years ago. And so that's producing this sense of vertigo, one might argue, that we have to try to figure out in order to advance and make some real progress as enterprises and as individuals in our lives.
Do you think that there's a sense there as well then that the different demographic groups may well start changing, how companies need to plan the employee experience? I mean, for example, I'm thinking of, say, someone at college today, they won't even remember a time before they could just pick up a device and talk to anybody anywhere in the world completely free, and there's a sort of consumer technologies ahead of what the corporate environment quite often is.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. Another way to put it might be that, people brought up and raised in technology, younger people are kind of pushing us ahead or coaxing us forward simply through their behaviors. They adapt to technology and they understand technology. Well, I mean, it's a sweeping statement, but, we all have nieces or kids and nephews that are very facile with devices. Sometimes they astound one with their ability with the 2 and 3 year olds that they seem to know how to manage a screen better perhaps than those in older generations. And there are good and perhaps negative aspects to that. That's a separate discussion. But, times are changing, consumers are changing, and the question is, are companies adapting and changing fast enough to keep up? And I gave an example a couple of minutes ago in the retail industry where there are real warning signs of the repercussions for those that are not delivering a holistic, unified customer experience that oftentimes, to your point, is going to be driven by perhaps not only younger people, but if you think about geographically and looking across the world, I know we've also chatted in the past about, what's going on in Asia, particularly in China, with the advance of different types of technologies and their population and how they're adapting very quickly. And then if you think about, too, the effects of 5G and the rollout of 5G across the world, and there's right now that sort of a tension between Huawei and how that's going to happen with China and how the West is going to integrate 5G technology. But there's so many things to think about when it comes to consumerism or techno-consumerism and how it's going to be influenced by generations and by geographies and by new technologies. There's a lot of things going on out there in this rapidly changing world.
Yeah, and you mentioned a minute ago about the sense of friction, so brands that can make life easier for the customer is one that would be successful. I mean, regardless of the kind of technologies they're using. Do you think that we might actually just start outsourcing a lot of our customer complaints and customer issues to something like digital assistants? I'll just ask my assistant to sort of chase up that retailer for me.
Yes, I think that, for example, AI-powered virtual agents are becoming obviously ever more popular, as it becomes inserted into the customer experience in ever more valuable ways. And one key driver of that trend is, what's happened the last few years is advanced speech recognition capabilities are finally sort of allowing the contact center to get access to cognitive abilities, if you will, that AI has to offer as it gets ever and ever more efficient or better. So natural language understanding means that AI-enabled devices, for example, can understand and process intent and context, and it's getting better all the time. And that's that idea of exponential technological change. AI solutions, they're demonstrating their effectiveness in a variety of ways. So, this advances in speech recognition, and then, of course, cloud-enabled delivery is really kind of opening up the field to those cognitive abilities that AI has to offer, and that hopefully will be woven in with an augment rather than replace human beings going forward. And we're talking more and more about that. You see more and more discussions on Twitter and on LinkedIn about the role of human beings and technology going forward. So hopefully there will be a complementary relationship between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean it's interesting because talking to a computer used to be the stuff of Star Trek, and yet now there's millions and millions of homes that are enabled with their Amazon Echo or Google Home, and it's completely normal just to walk into your home and ask Alexa to play some music. But do you think that enough brands have really tapped into this as a whole new channel yet? Because I know that if I just asked my Alexa to get me a hotel tomorrow night in Washington, D.C., I'm sure it will just say it doesn't understand what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and that goes back to this sense of disorientation, if you will, or sort of because the technology is advancing so quickly, and there's that word exponentially again. I don't think that we as organizations are keeping up as quickly just because things are changing so fast. They're definitely, you sense a lag in, for example, a lot of conversations around the IoT with business leaders, that they still don't quite know what that means for their organizations in so many cases. And then, as I just mentioned, of course, 5G, which is going to be inextricably entwined with the IoT, people are it's a bit of a deer in the headlights situation where they're trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean for my company? And how are we going to keep up? So I think it goes back to that line, and I've used this before in the great restructuring, Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson call it, where, we're at a time that they call the great restructuring, where technology is racing ahead and enterprises are trying to keep up and figure out how to integrate it effectively.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with that pace of change being so fast, how do we avoid a sense of disorientation? Ideas can become new global companies in months just by launching a new service on the App Store. Companies are taking ideas and they're jumping across industries. I mean, who would have thought that Apple would be one of the biggest payment companies in the world, or Amazon, which everyone thinks of as a retailer, but is actually driving most of the internet with AWS. I mean, how do we stay ahead of the competition when all the rules of competition have been torn up?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, so many people have read this book, Sapiens, by Harari, the Israeli historian, and he puts it in a similar way. He says, we're at a time, in his opinion, where for the first time in human history, the ability to see further into the future and predict what's going to happen within a certain range of accuracy just isn't there anymore. So in other words, maybe 50, 100, 150 years ago, et cetera, you could pretty much tell what life was going to look like in the next 5, 10, 20 years, et cetera. Whereas today, we just don't know, to your point, in 5 or 10 years, what new technologies are going to come along or be improved to such an extent that they're going to disrupt a certain industry in such a way that, Steve Case calls it the third wave of the internet that we're in, where innovation is going to impact real world industries in such ways that the way we live our lives is going to change. And so your question about, well, how do you cope with that? It's about trying, it seems to me, to future-proof, which is a nice expression, or accommodate the unknown by trying to integrate not only agile technologies and processes, but a real philosophy of agility in organizations and in people. And that's obviously much easier said than done. But, we're all it's imperative that we all as individuals be learning new skills and be adapting and changing, and so too in organizations. And in both cases, that can be extremely challenging. Some people and some organizations seem to have a gift for it and understand how to do it. And then there are others that find change and adaptation very difficult. And so that I don't have any answers, but the fact that we're asking the question points to hopefully a sense of optimism that we're going to be able to grapple with the pace of change going forward effectively and in a manner that's going to help us not only thrive as organizations, but serve our customers better.
Okay, great. And then finally, I suppose, if you're engaged with an organization that's asking you to think about these sorts of changes, then what are the first sort of areas that you look at? Is it really the culture of the organization rather than, individual technologies that you're looking at first?
Yeah, I think that, we've heard this before, but I believe it's true that the culture of the organization starts with the person or the people at the top of the organization, and it has to start there and sort of ripple throughout the entire enterprise, if you will. And if you don't have buy-in, in other words, from the highest levels, your culture is going to be off, and we see that all the time. And you see it in, for example, a good metaphor would be in sports. And just last night, I was having a couple of beers with friends talking about trying to figure out, and we've had this discussion for years, how it is that the New England Patriots, for example, are so good for so many years in such a competitive space that the NFL is. And, all these teams have so much money to invest. Why is it that the New England Patriots seem to have figured out a way? And I think it speaks to your point about the culture of the organization somehow seems to have embedded a way of doing things and a way of thinking from the very top, the ownership through the coaching, through the players and the fans, that it's redounded through the years and into a very successful enterprise as an organization. So obviously I'm a big Boston sports fan, but the metaphor is apt when it comes to enterprises across industries. And how do you get that type of success? And it's a great question to puzzle over.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm @Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.